Sharon, do you really want to know?
Do you really want to know?
Hello.
Hello, and welcome again to the Project Failure Files. I'm Sharon Weaver, CEO of Smarter Consulting.
And I am Christian Buckley, founder of Collab Talk. And welcome to another weekly episode of our series where Sharon and I will explore what not to do as you manage projects.
If you manage projects, this is the series for you. We both come from project management backgrounds, and in each episode of the Project Failure Files, we're going to talk about common pitfalls in project management. We'll share personal stories and experiences and explore strategies and best practices that will help you be successful.
Our approach in this series is to take an anti-pattern perspective. So we'll talk about what not to do in project management, sharing theory as well as practical examples and best practices.
So for this episode, we are going to talk about innovation paralysis, fear of change and new ideas, and how fear of change can cause project stagnation.
Each week we share, of course, personal stories and advice. I think you've got a story lined up for this. I've got some experience that directly relate to this. But we always start with some basic definitions and outline the topic.
And with the personal stories and example, our goal is really to help you understand the scope of all the issues that we cover in the series.
And we cover practical solutions, actionable strategies. You need to be able to do something with what you're hearing about from the session. And from that, improve your project management skills.
We also cover cultural issues of every topic because lasting change requires you to understand and make adjustments in your organization's cultural dynamics.
And of course, we're also going to share our thoughts on preventive measures too. So it's a lot to cover in 30 minutes, but we can do it. Probably 30 minutes.
Yeah, we can do it. So let's start. Let's kick things off and we'll talk about fear of change and new ideas.
And of course, if you have ideas, comments, feedback on this, you have horror stories of your own around these topics, please share it, comment. I'm going to be sharing some other links out to our community page. You can find past episodes out on YouTube and all around there. So there's a lot. There's a lot that we try to cover and jam pack into each episode. If we leave something out, let us know. We'll cover it in a future episode.
All right. Where are we going to start this time?
Well, I think where we should start is, exactly what not to do. For example, I was thinking about this is not being straightforward with your project stakeholders about a delay in the project and why there's a delay, or there's a need for more people or more budget to be able to achieve that target delivery date. You avoid the hard conversations, or something bigger, like telling people who are trying to make a change, that's not the way that we do things around here. It's so cliche to say that, and yet I've heard that, like, that's not your job. My response to that, the last time I heard, I've heard it multiple times in the last 15 years. I just remember one instance where my response right on top of that, like I was expecting, that's not your job. I said, well, it's nobody's job. It needs to be done. I've done it before. I know how to handle that. It's not part of my job description, but I'm doing it. When you find somebody else that should be doing it, let them know and I'll do a handoff. Until then, I'm doing it.
Well, I love the one where
that didn't go over well, by the way.
I love the one where, somebody brings up a new thought or a new innovative idea or something that you haven't thought of. They're like, oh no, somebody smarter than me already made that decision. It's not on me to think about it. It's not on me to change. It's not on me to learn. And always, always, always is the infamous, I don't want to learn something new.
Yeah, no, it's it's above my pay grade cop out. I mean, look, sometimes I'll be fair that sometimes it's like, it's true. It's like, look, I can't go do something, but did you document the risk? Did you document the piece? Did you run it up the proper channels for that thing? It's don't get stuck in that mistake of not taking action because of fear or bad process or not knowing who that thing is. I mean, it makes me think of somebody comes in, there's some companies that have this. And I know in the retail industry, for example, That somebody comes to an employee and says, "Oh, I've got this issue." Well, that's not my department. Let's go find the person who owns this and walk with them. Yeah, go ahead.
I was also going to say, I really think to that point, oftentimes project managers are really afraid sometimes because they come in and they want to talk to, the risks and the issues. And I think oftentimes there's this fear of bringing up things that need to change. And so what ends up happening is project managers become project schedulers or paper pushers, because while they have it in them to come up with those issues, and we can talk more about this in issues and risks, but when we talk about the idea of changing, when they bring those things up to be like, we need to talk about this because the sooner we change, the sooner we identify, the sooner we deal with it, the sooner we're going to be out of this pain, people don't want to hear it. And so what ends up happening is project managers become very afraid to bring up the topic of change because of that reason.
Yeah. Most of my career I've worked for some really big companies. I mean, Pacific Bells, the phone company, Hewlett Packard, Microsoft. So I've consulted with some very large corporations, global recognized brand names out there as well. But I think of myself more as a small company, a startup entrepreneurial person. And part of that is because of the recognition that change happens. And it was a strength of a lot of these organizations that were able to adapt and change. I mean, a lot of the resistance that you run into where you have this issue is like reluctance to adopt new technology, because it's going to be a hard problem to solve. It's not straightforward. It's not just new features. There are risks to go through. The other side of that is that, which we will cover in another episode, is the bureaucracy over that. A lot of times, from a cultural standpoint, a lot of organizations culturally fail to recognize and do anything about change that needs to happen. They put bureaucratic layers in place to stifle those things. Mm-hmm. And what may have started by, and this is somebody who's run, IT and project governance bodies around that. People hear that and they think bureaucracy, layers of decisions through committee. Like, no, it can be very lean and efficient. It's more about documentation, adhering to the methodology, adhering to the plan of record. But that's how I think the cultural barriers are probably the number one problem behind this issue of the fear of innovation.
Yeah, I think so. What's really interesting to me is we find there's a really high correlation in business between businesses that are willing to be open to change and innovation versus businesses that don't. And so I think, there is such a thing as managing control. When you think about controlling scope, controlling budget, controlling time, I think there's something to be said for controlling change as well. But the people who are not open to the change, we're not saying that you have to change. We're not saying that it's like, nothing's ever the same and we're changing all the time. We know that can be a problem, like you said, in and of itself. But I think when you have this kind of cultural bureaucracy of, we're not ever going to be open to anything that changed because there's some risk in it, that can cause its own issues.
Yeah. It's seeing like the negative mindset in a lot of organizations, again, go back to it's like, that's not the way that we do it here. Mm-hmm. Or we've never done that. We've always done this, those things. It's like, well, then what you're doing is you're trying to squelch any kind of progress made. We talk about this all the time. I'm a big W. Edwards Deming advocate. I could hear his voice in my head saying, optimize the system. If you've not seen the Deming video, but that idea that part of ongoing operations is to constantly be inward looking. Are we doing things the right way, the most efficient way, the best way? Project management needs to be that as well. You have your methodology. And as we always talk about, I don't care what methodology is, just have a methodology, be consistent in your approach to projects. You'll better be able to see where, hey, this is really inefficient. We spend way too much time on the scoping activity and not enough on, these other phases where, like, whatever that is. Well, it's like we used to joke that, QA is where all projects go to die. It's like, well, it's like, well, you need to be secure, you need to be risk, aware. But you're right, you can't let testing, you can't let fear of these risks derail progress forward.
Right.
You can't measure, you can't make progress and measure the success of something that doesn't move forward. You need to move things forward.
Well, and I think as project managers, even though technically you're not managing people, you still are leading. People are still watching you. And I think when you embody the openness to change, you also, we've talked about this on past episodes, but it's the idea of getting to trust each other and building team cohesion. And I think when you are open to, maybe you're not right all the time, or maybe you don't know everything, or maybe, you need to be open to a conversation of things on the project that aren't going the way that you thought they were going to go. I think when you lead by that example, it allows your team to say, oh, well, maybe I don't like this either, or maybe this isn't going down the right track, or maybe, I can provide feedback. And so I think when we think about being innovative and having change and being afraid of, new things coming in, it's not just new tech. It's not just, I want to do something different. It's the idea of people being able to voice those concerns and maybe going a different direction, or maybe changing roles, or maybe changing paths in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise if you hadn't been open to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Think about what are the impacts of resistance to change? Like, what have you seen? What are some examples?
So, I mean, I have a really great example of a story that I've told over and over and over. When I was getting my Six Sigma black belt, I worked on several green belt projects. And one of the projects they brought me in on, they had already made a decision. So it was a tool selection project for technology. And the team had said, we're struggling with the tool we have. We've already gone through the selection process. We've already picked a different tool. And they had like $1 million budget to replace this tool. And they brought me in as the belt. They're like, basically, the previous green belt has already done all the work. All you have to do is walk in and basically get us past the finish line. Well, being the annoying person that I am, I said, well, can I at least review everything? And can we have a little tiny bit of kind of going back and saying, is this really even the right decision? And they were like, wait, what? No, we've already made this decision. And I was like, well, part of my job and part of me learning is to go back and revisit this. So like, okay, they kind of appeased me, like, yeah, we'll have one meeting and we'll talk about this. And what was real fun is we went back and we talked about all of it. And I'm like, well, let me understand, what your struggles are with this tool. Come to find out, they really actually had the best tool on the market. What they didn't have is an understanding of how to use the tool. What they didn't have was a few specific features that they wanted in the tool set that didn't exist. And so I reached out to the tool company and said, are these things that, could be added for a fee? And they were like, absolutely. Now, I know this is going to shock you, but the cost of training and adding a couple of features to an existing tool set was far less than implementing a brand new tool. And so they were being open-minded to this idea of maybe this tool isn't working for us anymore. Maybe we need to move to a different tool, but they were now fixed in this mindset that was the only way to solve their problem. By bringing a fresh perspective to it, we were then able to actually keep the existing tool set, and with some training, some feature adds, actually solved the problem. And so I think sometimes, we think about, well, we're being open to this change, but the idea of new idea was maybe we don't actually need to change anyways. Maybe we just need to kind of, do something a little bit different.
Isn't it funny how, and something we talk all the time about is that you need to understand the problem and the desired outcomes before you start to solve it. I mean, famously, I mean, it's not entirely true, but famously we say software engineers, love solving problems that don't exist yet. They're creating
There's a solution for every problem.
Right. But the similar to that story, I mean, I have previous life was the chief evangelist for a software company, and had some questions or some conversations with my sales team. They're like, you talked this client out of a sale. I said, I tried to understand what the customer was trying to do. And based on what they were trying to do, I explained that with their current version, they were able to accomplish what they wanted to do. You're trying to sell them something that they don't actually need yet. And ultimately, we would lose that client. They would either find out in the process, or they would not be happy with the end result because they spent a bunch of money on something. And when the reality is, they just needed to better understand, kind of just like your example, like leverage what's already there, make some modifications. I mean, that's part of this whole story of the low code, no code solutions, is like leverage more of what you have and add on to that thing, which is not to say that sometimes a complete overhaul, an upgrade, or whatever it is, isn't needed, but you need to make sure that you understand, what are we actually trying to achieve here? Because one thing I would always say, coming from a SharePoint background, a great example of this, where Microsoft people would hate it when I would say, like, you don't need to upgrade with what you're trying to do. You don't need to be on the latest version of that. This is the old on-prem days. I said, you're getting everything you need out of the older version. Like, are there some new features that are kind of cool? It's like, yeah, but for what you're trying to do, like, you don't need to go and do that. You can leverage this. And there's actually, like, nowadays, there's more and more hybrid, because people have said, hey, it makes more sense for us to have the additional overhead of managing a hybrid environment with both on-prem and online solutions, meet our needs. But in the long term scheme of things, it's cheaper than moving all of those on-prem into the cloud. And so, I mean, that's another thing. I know with this day and age, we're not supposed to talk about how the cloud can be more expensive and not as feature rich as something that you're doing on-prem. It depends in a lot of scenarios.
I was actually just thinking about that. I did a full assessment for one of my clients at one point. I was actually thinking through all of the different times that I've met with people, and they're like, oh, well, should I go to this new thing? Because it's, it's all the trend, it's all the buzz. Should I go to this? And I remember early on, I did an assessment for one of my clients, and I did a full write-up of, is it worth it to go to the cloud or not? And at that point, it was not, because honestly, back to your point of what problem are we trying to solve? I was like, well, why? If you're going just because it's cool, just because it's new, just because it's buzzy, I don't know that that's the right reason. And so we reviewed all of their, concerns and their thoughts and the risks, and we talked about all of it, and we did a full assessment. At the end of the day, my recommendation to them at that time was, I don't think it's time for you to do that yet. I don't think it's the right answer. But now I talk to so many people, and, they're like, well, should I do this? And a lot of times now I'm saying yes more and more and more, because the modern workplace has been built out so much further than it was 5 or 10 years ago, that now it's starting to become, very beneficial for a lot of people to move to it.
Right. I mean, we need to be careful that we don't get into this analysis paralysis, that we get stuck in that decision making. But that's a big part of this. I mean, a lot of that project stagnation comes because, like, somebody just needs to make a decision, make a call. Like, as a project manager, a lot of times, like, you're too low level to be able to actually make a decision on that. You're having to accomplish a lot of your work through what other people are doing, what decision makers, what your stakeholders are deciding about the project. So you got to go make the case. You've got to lobby for this. Said, based on our understanding, based on the data, here's my recommendation. Let's move forward with this. So that's something that you just need to overcome that fear, to encourage innovation. You need to build a case for that change. That should be you could have a standard template for that. Whenever you get stuck, like, go in and make that case. Look, this is what it is. This is what our goal is. Do we agree? This is the goal. These are the outcome to achieve. To do it, we can go one of 3 ways. This way, it would cost this. It would take this much time. This is what it'd be. The second way, same. Third, like, let's make a decision. My recommendation is on option 3. Here's why, but here are the risks with all 3. Make a decision around that and make it clear that you need their decision. I used to always love around those decisions when it was like out of my hands, it's now back in the stakeholder. And I get to hear from my director, my VP, the leader saying, why are we not making any progress on this? This is waiting for an answer from this team, from this person. We're now delayed 2 weeks because they've not made up their mind. I said, I've outlined this. What questions? I mean, it's valid if that person can't make a decision because they're waiting for more data, more whatever those things are. But I treat a lot of this, Sharon, like hot potato. I don't want the hot potato in my hands, in my lap. I want it back over there. I want to make sure that my job is to move it forward as the PM.
Yeah.
And here's the information. If you don't have the information you need to let me know. But at some point, like we've got this information and it becomes readily apparent where somebody's just stalling because they're afraid to make a decision around that.
Well, and I think, that comes back to culture. So, here we get to talk about culture, and it's a great lead in because I do an entire presentation on change management. I just gave it a couple of weeks ago. And I talk about cultural change. And sometimes, we've said over and over and over, we don't care what methodology you have, just have one. I think when it comes to culture, it's the idea of know your culture. So as a project manager, understand your culture. Is your culture very, very change averse? Is your culture very, very open to change, or are you somewhere in the middle? I think when you understand what that culture is, you can then take your own temperature of how open am I to change and how open is my culture to change, and do we match? Because if you're more innovative and more wanting to change than your culture is ready for, then you're going to have a lot of friction, with those conversations. But if you're not as open to change and your culture is more open to change, then you're going to feel like you're dragging your feet. So I think if you understand your how you feel about change and how your culture feels about change, and you match that as much as possible, you're going to feel like you're kind of in the pocket, right?
A great aspect of the cultural aspect of that is that you feel like you have a safe environment to experiment. If you're in an organization that if there's a project that fails, you have the postmortem, maybe somebody screwed something up, but it's usually not. It's a bunch of different factors around that. And what a lot of companies do is they go like, who do we blame? Who do we fire because of this failure?
Yes.
And the PM, it's like, look, there could be project management failures, but a lot of HR people, hiring managers, understand this is like, if you find an intelligent person that's a cultural fit within that, what the failures tend to be not that person. It could be that they didn't know something, whatever, but you go back and you look at what can we change, what can we fix. We don't want to penalize the individuals that are the communications layer of like the project. Like they were doing their job. Is it a failure of the methodology? Did we have like the stakeholder, like based on the information, it turned out to be the wrong decision? Like I've been on a massive project. It was a multi-million-dollar project. We made selection, but we went through the criteria. Everybody saw throughout that entire process that everybody had a voice when that. We said, here's why we're making this decision. We went in, and what failed about that is that the vendor was not as honest about what they could do with things that were in their roadmap. Right. One of the lessons learned from that postmortem was to go and build our solutions based off of existing features, not off of future roadmaps.
Yeah.
I said, understand is like, great. Well, it's going to take you another year for you to go build those features in your product. And then it needs to be tested. It needs to be hardened out there. There's going to be other problems with it. So let's say 3 years from now, we might be moving on to like looking again as part of the renewal process at that next system. You'll be at that next phase. And we'll have requirements that are far beyond what you have for that version of your product as well. But if you are basing it off of what's available, what's there today, you are removing a lot of risks for your project as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
But not penalize them. My point of that was not penalizing people for experimenting, for trying that, but using them as learning. Because what I've learned is where I've had project managers who have made mistakes is they tend to not make those mistakes ever again.
Yeah.
And it sharpens the senses when
No,
yeah.
I definitely think that's a big issue. I really want to pull that nugget out of what you're saying, because I think, especially since our target audience is project managers or people who are in that project management space, we're talking about anti-patterns, right? And I'm going to tell you, one of the biggest failures that I see is companies that hire project managers, whatever title it is that they're going under, they give them an authority to identify risks and issues and manage the project. But when they identify risks and issues and come and say, hey, if we do this, it's going to be a problem, they go, why are you being so annoying, scary? Why are you always, being frustrated about things? Why are you always yelling at me for doing the wrong thing? Like, however you look at that culturally, we talk about anti-patterns. If you're not listening to the advice of the person that you put in that role to do that job, and instead are telling them, just sit down and write down the dates and stop telling us about all the scary stuff, you are just dooming your teams to that. Because to your point, you must feel safe as a project manager. You must feel safe to go in and say, look, these are problems. We need to deal with these. And the team needs to respect that and say, hey, if they're bringing up an issue, there's a reason, and maybe I should do something about it. And if we want to talk about anti-patterns, in my opinion, that is one of the big failures we're hitting right now.
Yeah. Well, the other half of that too is then, so they're just like, whatever needs to happen there, they don't make the best decision on that. They're not taking that seriously. And then when that risk becomes a reality, and maybe there's the plans, like, here's how we mitigate this thing, but then again, go and blame the PM for that. I mean, ultimately, the project manager's job usually is not to make the decision. It's to say, here's the plan. Based on these decisions, based on this plan outcome, here's what this looks like. Go and execute against that. To put up here's the decision that you as the stakeholder need to make. Here's the options. Here's the risk, the cost, the time, all the thing. You make a decision around that. Again, I'll go back to this former client, this multi-million-dollar project. They went with what they thought was the cheaper option that was the higher risk. They rolled the dice, and it bit them.
Yep.
And so then, of course, they go back and they point the finger at the senior team in IT. But and the senior team in IT is like, we told you like this, and you wanted to go this version. Like, their recommendation was the double the price, but we're confident it'll be exactly what we want. And you went with something else. And they ended up losing most of that, over $1 million project, and had to pay for the multi-million-dollar project ultimately. So they're big $1 billion revenue. Anyway, it wasn't that high of cost, but at the time they were only a $400 to $500 million company, so they're much smaller.
And the other side to that, I think, too, is when you have leaders or project managers who sit in the corner and are quiet, right? So we've talked about the failure to listen, the failure to identify, the failure to respect. I think anytime you have a project manager, a scrum master, or a leader that's just sitting in the corner and not saying anything ever, I promise you, every single project has friction. It's just like every family has friction. Every team has friction. People come to me and go, I don't know what's wrong. We're not progressing. And I'm like, well, how much friction do you have? Well, we have no friction. I'm like, well, then something's wrong. You're not getting to that storming phase that you need to get past the hurdle. So I find that the most successful innovation, the most successful change comes through friction. And if you're not allowing that friction to happen, then you're going to have a problem. So, that's a bad thing to watch for too.
And this is part of it why I've always been, having run PMOs. I'm a big fan of the roundtable discussion where we go through for each of our projects and discuss that. And if there's no friction, meaning there's not collaboration happening, it makes me nervous. Like, are all of us so perfect in our plans that no one else has any questions around that? No, the reality is that we become blind to some things that might be obvious to someone else, or learnings that they saw in their project. So that's to be able to go in, it's like almost going in, if you've never sat in front of like a venture capitalist and pitched your company, your idea around that, and you try as best you can to prepare to answer those questions. Inevitably, there'll be questions that you don't know the answer to, and to say like, I don't know, but I need to go find that out. I mean, that's the kind of the friction, the collaboration that should be happening, where your peers ask a lot of questions about your project, and you're able to go, yes, we thought of that. Yes, that's in this piece. Yes, that's at the next phase. Great. Fantastic. Like that's so you need to have that level of communication and collaboration across your team, across the organization. The stakeholders need to know that. You can't be silent in these discussions. Like it's the sin of omission of of not doing something, not saying something. There is no like, well, I knew there was something wrong with that. Well, then why didn't you raise your hand? Why didn't you say something? That goes back to the cultural aspect of how is the openness? Are they afraid to interject, to call the emperor naked, when you see something? And then, another aspect of that, rewarding innovation and adaptability. So to recognize people that break a system to improve it, that find the holes, the gaps. I mean, I've been in organizations where they did this, where we said, hey, look, if you find a bug somewhere within this, like, we'll pay for bugs. And people are in there looking for it. And you think, well, can't they just go and build mistakes into the code so that they can be paid extra? I'm like, that happens rarely. Usually that stuff gets found out. If there's like shoddy work of somebody, there's different measures of the quality of coding of engineers. But that generally doesn't happen like that. But to have ethical hackers, to have people that are looking at process, to have a reward system for people to go and say, well, if there's it needs to be like a 5 to 10% efficiency, whatever the measures are, to get the reward. But if you find something that makes us more efficient somehow, somewhere, you build a culture where people are going to start pointing out, hey, there's a better way of doing that, the way that we're doing it. We need to stop that. We need to do this.
Yeah, we talk about the maturity model, that we have the maturity model for Microsoft 365, which is based on the lean maturity model. And when we talk about maturity models in business, to your point, when we get up into that 400 and 500 level range, a lot of people are like, yeah, but what are you doing different? And I think that is the difference, is that you're not only being innovative, you're not only being open to change, you're not only open to new ideas, you're out there saying, what can we do differently? What can we do that's going to challenge the norm? What can we do that's going to make people notice? What can we do that's going to have a good impact on our business in general? And not only are you doing, but you're being supported and you're being celebrated for those things within your own organization and outside your organization. People see that, when they look outside the organization, inside the organization, identifying those positive changes, those new ideas that you're doing that are different, those are really, really well rewarded at a very high maturity level organization.
Well, thinking too, we've got a couple minutes left, thinking about preventive measures, what actionable steps people can take. I mean, one of the first things that you and I always talk about is look at your change management framework, that methodology. So if you have, again, you can go build your own around a number of different methodologies, styles that are out there, but take a look at a bunch of change management frameworks, things like ADKAR, of Kotter's 8-step process. I've blogged about that on buckleyplanet.com. Kotter, Kotter. You can find some info there, because that can help systematically change, those systems thinking around change, organizational change, and look at the various processes that are in there. And then put together, make it simple for people, kind of a step-by-step guide, spell it out for people of how we're going to implement change within a project. Great example, external consultants have like a change request form. It's a pretty standard thing. We have our plan of record. What happens, it's not rare, it happens all the time, of I didn't think of this before, or I need to even expand further on that, which increases the scope of that. And so there's a formal change request. There's nothing wrong with the change request. But what that allows the project manager to do is look at the scope of that change, understand, does it fit within the normal,
Tolerance.
the team, the tolerance, thank you,
Yeah.
of that, or does it require replanning, new timeline, new budget, personnel, all the things around that? And then the business, the stakeholder, can make a decision. Yes, I want to pay for that. Here's how this would impact everything else. So they're then making a decision based on that. And just the CYA,
write it down.
Keep all that documentation in place.
Write it down.
I've had to show receipts on that so many times. Go back to that, like, here's the email from you authorizing us to make that change, which delayed the schedule. So we're delayed because you said yes to this change.
Yes. Yeah, that would definitely be my nugget for practical advice is record it, write it down, get it in email, get it signed, make sure that people are aware of what's going on. Always be open to it and always have those conversations, but definitely write down decisions.
Well, one last thing that I would say as part of that review is that, like doing a postmortem on a project is fantastic, but there also needs to be a regular cycle, like maybe quarterly, where you specifically review the process. You're doing a regular postmortem on projects that are closed, and let's go back and look specifically at the process itself. You're doing a little bit of that project by project in those postmortems. You look at what failed in the process and changes there. But going back and looking at your tools, your methodology, and all of that, again, that systems approach to how we're managing projects is important to do that outside of the context, the bias of a project. And so 100%. That's something that part of your culture, build it in your culture.
Yep, totally agree.
So, well, I know that's a lot, as always, Sharon. We jam pack a lot into the time here. As always, say that please follow us out on X, Twitter, Twix, whatever it is. Follow us out on there. We talk a lot about a number of different projects and ideas and lots of stuff. There's always stuff going on. We also created this Project Failure Files group out on Facebook. So please come share your thoughts, your feedback on an episode. You can find out about other topics. So it's brand new. We're trying to start up conversation there. We want to hear your horror stories, like what went wrong, what you learned from that, which may make it into a future episode. And then, of course, to go take a look at the past episodes out on YouTube /at Buckley Planet. You can find them on my blog, and there you can find them through Sharon's YouTube page and stuff out there. We're trying to force Sharon to do more blogging as well.
We'll get there.
So with that, well, thank you so much, Sharon. Always great. And thanks everybody for watching.
Thanks for joining us.